Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the medieval world, a 1,000-year stretch of history that people often imagine as simple, brutal, and strangely distant. But the more closely you look, the less simple it becomes. Beneath the castles and kings, beneath the battles that fill most textbooks, there was a quieter medieval life shaped by paperwork, weather, faith, routine, fear, invention, hunger, ceremony, and endless negotiation. Some of the most revealing parts of the age were not the famous events at all, but the ordinary realities that held society together. And that is what makes medieval times so fascinating. Not just the great wars or the famous rulers, but the unnoticed details that explain how millions of people actually lived, worked, obeyed, worshipped, traded, and survived. If you enjoy long, thoughtful history like this, consider subscribing. A lot of regular listeners do, simply so they can keep finding these slower, deeper stories, and it helps the channel continue making careful documentaries like this one. When people picture the medieval period, they usually reach for a narrow set of images. Stone castles on windswept hills, armored knights, dark halls lit by fire, monks bending over manuscripts, a peasant pushing a plow through wet earth. Those images are not wrong, but they are incomplete. Medieval life was not only about warfare and noble rivalry. It was also about administration, memory, obligation, and improvisation. It was a world in which most people lived close to the limits of survival, yet within that hard reality they built institutions that were surprisingly durable and often surprisingly sophisticated. One of the least discussed features of medieval life is just how deeply people lived inside systems of obligation. Modern people tend to think in terms of individual choice, personal mobility, and legal equality, but medieval society was built on layered dependence. A peasant might owe labor to a lord, rent on a plot of land, dues at harvest time, and religious obligations to the local church. A knight owed military service upward and expected income downward. A bishop might be a spiritual leader, a landholder, and a political actor at the same time. Rights existed, but they were almost always tied to status, place, and custom. To live in the medieval world was to know where you stood in relation to everyone else, and to understand that security usually came not from freedom, but from attachment. That attachment shaped the landscape itself. Villages were not random clusters of houses. They were working communities tied to fields, meadows, woods, mills, ovens, streams, and roads, all governed by habits that had developed over generations. In many places, open field farming required collective coordination. People sowed and harvested according to shared rhythms, because the land was not always divided into neat private blocks as we might imagine today. A person's survival depended not only on private effort, but on cooperation with neighbors who could also become rivals in years of shortage. Medieval life was local in the deepest sense. Most people would never travel very far. Their world was measured in walking distance, seasonal change, and rumor from beyond the horizon. And rumor mattered because information traveled slowly, unevenly, and often unreliably. News might arrive through merchants, clergy, pilgrims, soldiers, or wandering laborers. A royal decree could exist on parchment in one place and remain practically unknown in another. What people knew about the wider world was shaped not by instant communication, but by fragmented networks of trust. In that environment, reputation became a form of power. So did memory. Communities remembered who owed what, which family had rights to which strip of land, where a boundary lay, what a lord had promised, and which customs had the force of law simply because they had been repeated for so long. In many cases, the medieval world functioned because people carried unwritten systems in their heads. This is another thing that often goes unnoticed. The Middle Ages were not illiterate in the simple sense people sometimes assume. Literacy was limited, yes, especially compared with the modern world, but writing mattered enormously. Charters, wills, account rolls, tax records, court proceedings, legal disputes, monastic chronicles, guild regulations, and private letters all formed part of medieval administration. Even societies with low literacy rates could be intensely documentary in the hands of clerks, monks, notaries, and officials. A kingdom could be remembered through parchment. A village dispute could turn on the wording of an old grant. A monastery could define its privileges through a carefully preserved archive. The medieval world was oral, but it was also written, and power often depended on controlling both. Medieval religion, too, is often flattened into stereotype. People remember the great cathedrals or the authority of the church, but not always the way religion structured time itself. The year moved through feast days, fasts, saints' days, penitential seasons, and rituals that marked birth, marriage, illness, harvest, and death. Religion was not a separate compartment of life. It organized the calendar, framed suffering, explained disaster, legitimized rule, and offered a language through which people interpreted almost everything. When crops failed, when disease spread, when war came, these were not merely material events. They had moral and spiritual meaning. That did not make medieval people irrational. It meant they lived inside a worldview where divine order and earthly order were closely connected. At the same time, medieval Christianity was not experienced in exactly the same way by everyone. The village priest, the monastery, the local shrine, the bishop's court, and the distant papacy were all part of religious life, but they could feel very different depending on where one stood. For some, religion meant routine and familiarity. Bells, prayers, processions, blessings over fields, candles for the dead. For others, it meant discipline, tithes, and fear of judgment. Pilgrimage offered movement in a largely immobile world. Relics drew crowds because they connected heaven to a difficult earth. Monasteries became centers not only of devotion, but of land management, scholarship, hospitality, and political influence. The medieval church was not a single texture. It was an enormous web of ideals, obligations, institutions, and human compromises. Another overlooked reality is how much of medieval life was lived at the edge of shortage. The medieval economy could be productive, but it was fragile. A sequence of bad harvests could undo years of relative stability. A harsh winter, excessive rain, animal disease, local conflict, or damaged infrastructure could push communities into crisis. Because most people spent a large share of their labor and income simply securing food, small disruptions mattered greatly. Grain prices could rise sharply. Debts became harder to bear. Malnutrition weakened bodies before famine ever officially arrived. In such a world, storing, milling, baking, brewing, and distributing food were not background details. They were central facts of political and social life. That is why mills and ovens mattered so much, and why lords often controlled them. These were not trivial conveniences. A mill turned grain into usable flour. An oven turned dough into bread that could sustain a household. Control over such facilities meant control over daily life and local revenue. Many medieval people paid to use the lord's mill or oven, not simply because it was convenient, but because custom or power gave them little choice. The infrastructure of ordinary life was often tied to authority. To study the Middle Ages closely is to realize that domination was not only military. It was built into roads, tolls, bridges, workshops, barns, fisheries, woodland rights, and access to tools. Yet the period was not static. Medieval society changed constantly, even if it often described itself through tradition. Agricultural methods improved in some regions. Trade expanded. Towns grew. Guilds developed. Markets linked distant places more tightly over time. Coins circulated alongside barter and payment in kind. Ports connected northern Europe, the Mediterranean, and lands far beyond. Textiles, salt, metals, wine, furs, timber, spices, wax, and grain moved through networks that could be remarkably extensive. Many people today still imagine the medieval world as isolated and motionless, but in reality it contained traders, sailors, scholars, diplomats, migrants, craftsmen, and religious travelers moving through long routes of exchange. Towns deserve special attention here because they complicate nearly every simple story about medieval society. Urban life could offer opportunities unavailable in the countryside. A town might provide paid work, commercial contacts, legal privileges, and a measure of distance from village obligations. Some towns developed charters that defined rights and local governance in ways that made them distinct political communities. Merchants and craftsmen organized themselves into guilds, not only for trade, but for regulation, protection, training, and social identity. Urban populations were still vulnerable to fire, disease, and political pressure, but towns were places where medieval life became visibly more diverse, more monetized, and in some cases more socially flexible. Even so, freedom in medieval towns had limits. Guild membership could exclude outsiders. Women participated in economic life in many ways, but access to power and protection varied sharply by place and status. Foreign merchants might be welcomed for their goods and distrusted for their difference. Jewish communities, where they existed in medieval Europe, often played important roles in commerce and finance while also facing exclusion, legal restriction, and periodic violence. This is one of the most important truths about the Middle Ages. It could be both organized and insecure, creative and harsh, devout and deeply intolerant. Law in the medieval world followed the same pattern. It was not absent. In fact, it was everywhere. But it did not always look like modern law. Custom, lordship, royal justice, canon law, urban privilege, feudal obligation, and communal practice could overlap in confusing ways. A dispute might involve witnesses, oaths, local memory, written record, and social standing all at once. Courts existed at different levels, and justice could be both formal and personal. Punishment was real, but so was negotiation. Settlements, compensations, reconciliations, and collective testimony often mattered as much as the dramatic judgments people tend to remember. Medieval law was not a vacuum of arbitrary force. It was a dense and evolving field in which power and procedure were always entangled. The household, too, was more than a private family unit. It was often a center of labor, hierarchy, training, and survival. Servants, apprentices, kin, lodgers, and dependents could all be part of the same domestic structure. Children entered work early by modern standards, and adulthood was shaped less by age alone than by economic role, marriage, and inheritance. Marriage itself was not simply romantic partnership. It was a social and economic arrangement with consequences for property, legitimacy, alliance, and labor. Women's experiences varied enormously across class, region, religion, and circumstance, but in every setting their work was fundamental, whether in agriculture, household production, trade, childcare, brewing, textile work, or estate management. And through all of this, nature remained a constant force that no ruler could fully command. Medieval people lived with darkness in a more literal way than we do, with stronger seasonal rhythms, harsher weather exposure, and a closer dependence on animals, wood, water, and soil. Forests were resources but also contested spaces. Rivers carried trade and danger. Weather was not small talk. It was destiny. A late frost or failed rain could alter the year ahead. The medieval world was human, political, and spiritual, but it was also ecological in a way modern urban societies sometimes forget. People did not simply live on the land. They negotiated with it every single season. As medieval communities navigated this demanding environment, one of the quiet forces shaping daily life was time itself. Today we measure time precisely, minutes, seconds, digital reminders, but in the medieval world time moved in broader, slower rhythms. For most people, the rising and setting of the sun mattered far more than the ticking of any device. Work began when daylight allowed it, and it ended when darkness made labor impossible. In winter, the working day was short and compressed. In summer, fields might keep people active from dawn until evening. Yet even this natural rhythm was intertwined with the church, whose bells divided the day into recognizable intervals of prayer. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline structured monastic life with extraordinary precision, and even villagers who did not follow the schedule strictly were aware of the pattern. Bells carried authority through sound. They marked prayer, warned of fire, summoned meetings, and announced deaths. Long before widespread clocks, communities knew time through ritual and repetition. This rhythm extended into the year as well. Medieval calendars were not only agricultural, they were ceremonial. The cycle of Lent, Easter, Pentecost, Advent, and Christmas shaped expectations and behavior across entire regions. Fasting periods restricted food, encouraging fish consumption over meat. Festivals broke routine and offered rare moments of celebration. Saints' days filled the calendar with stories and processions, connecting local identity with wider Christian tradition. For many villagers, the local churchyard became a central gathering place where religious devotion and social life blended. Markets might be scheduled around feast days. Pilgrims arrived carrying tales from distant shrines. A community's memory was partly preserved in the stories attached to these holy days. Yet medieval festivals were not only solemn or spiritual occasions. They could be lively, crowded, and sometimes chaotic. Markets expanded during major celebrations. Traveling entertainers, musicians, storytellers, and craftsmen might appear, offering a glimpse of worlds beyond the village boundary. Seasonal fairs in particular became major economic events, especially in parts of France, England, and the Low Countries. These gatherings could attract merchants from hundreds of miles away. Cloth from Flanders, wine from southern Europe, spices from eastern trade routes, and metals from mining regions might all change hands during a single busy week. What might look like a simple fair in a quiet town could actually represent the meeting point of enormous trade networks. This commercial energy gradually reshaped parts of the medieval economy. While agriculture remained dominant, money transactions slowly became more common. Coins circulated in markets, taxes were sometimes collected in currency, and long-distance merchants developed systems of credit that reduced the need to carry large amounts of silver or gold. Early financial tools such as bills of exchange allowed traders to move wealth across distances without transporting it physically. These innovations were modest compared to modern banking, but they reveal something important. The medieval economy was capable of adaptation. Far from being frozen in time, it responded to opportunity, population growth, and expanding trade routes. The growth of towns played a major role in this transformation. By the High Middle Ages, roughly the period from the 11th to the 13th centuries, many European towns were becoming more vibrant and influential. Stone walls surrounded busy streets where workshops, taverns, bakeries, and stalls crowded together. The smells alone could be overwhelming. Smoke from hearths, leather from tanneries, spices from traders, and the constant presence of animals. Streets were narrow and often muddy, but they pulsed with activity. Artisans hammered metal, spun thread, carved wood, and shaped pottery. Apprentices learned trades through long training periods under experienced masters. A guild might regulate how goods were produced, how prices were set, and how members treated one another. Guilds were powerful institutions in urban life, though they are sometimes misunderstood today. They were not merely trade associations. They were social networks, welfare systems, and regulatory bodies all at once. If a craftsman became sick or died, the guild might assist the family. Guild members participated in religious processions together and sometimes funded chapels dedicated to patron saints. At the same time, guilds protected their economic position by controlling who could enter the trade. This meant that opportunity could exist in towns, but it was rarely open to everyone equally. A newcomer without connections might struggle to gain acceptance. Despite these barriers, towns offered something that the countryside often did not: a measure of independence. Medieval sayings sometimes captured this idea with the phrase "town air makes free." In some regions, a person who escaped rural servitude and lived in a town for a certain period, often a year and a day, might gain legal freedom from former obligations. This was not universal law, and lords frequently resisted losing laborers, but the possibility existed. For ambitious individuals, towns could represent a chance to reshape their future, even if the path was uncertain. Urban growth also encouraged the development of new political structures. Town councils, elected officials, and charters began to appear in many places. These documents defined rights such as holding markets, collecting tolls, or maintaining defensive walls. While kings and nobles still held ultimate authority in most cases, towns could negotiate privileges that gave them considerable influence. Wealthy merchants sometimes lent money to rulers, funded building projects, or helped finance wars. Gradually, the medieval political landscape became more complex, with cities acting as important players alongside traditional feudal authorities. One of the most visible signs of urban prosperity was the construction of great cathedrals. These massive stone buildings required enormous labor and resources. Quarry workers cut blocks of limestone or sandstone. Carpenters shaped scaffolding and roof beams. Skilled masons carved intricate designs into pillars and doorways. Stained glass artists created luminous windows that filled interiors with colored light. Construction could take decades, sometimes centuries, and generations of workers might contribute to a single project. Cathedrals were more than places of worship. They symbolized civic pride, spiritual aspiration, and technological achievement. The pointed arches and flying buttresses of Gothic architecture allowed walls to rise higher than ever before, transforming skylines across Europe. For ordinary townspeople, however, life remained uncertain. Disease was a constant threat. Sanitation was limited, and crowded living conditions could allow illness to spread quickly. Even common infections that modern medicine treats easily could become fatal. Hospitals did exist in medieval towns, but they were often run by religious institutions and focused as much on spiritual care as medical treatment. Knowledge of anatomy and disease was still developing, though medieval physicians drew upon ancient texts from Greek and Roman writers as well as Arabic medical scholarship. Treatments included herbal remedies, dietary advice, and procedures that reflected the prevailing theory of bodily humors. Yet medical practice was only one part of a broader medieval understanding of health. Clean water sources, access to food, and seasonal stability were equally important factors. Many people relied on practical knowledge passed down through generations: how to prepare certain herbs, when to harvest plants, how to treat minor injuries or infections. Midwives assisted with childbirth, which remained a dangerous moment in life for both mother and child. Survival into adulthood was never guaranteed, and families often experienced loss in ways that were tragically routine. In the countryside, meanwhile, agricultural innovations slowly improved productivity in some regions. The heavy plow, capable of turning thick northern European soils, expanded the range of land that could be farmed effectively. The horse collar allowed horses to pull plows without choking under the strain, increasing efficiency compared to older harness designs. Crop rotation systems, especially the three-field system, helped maintain soil fertility by alternating grains with legumes and leaving some land fallow. These developments did not eliminate hardship, but they allowed medieval agriculture to support larger populations than earlier centuries had managed. Population growth during the High Middle Ages led to the clearing of forests and the creation of new settlements. Villages expanded into areas that had previously been sparsely inhabited. Monasteries often played a role in organizing these efforts, draining marshlands, building mills, and encouraging agricultural development. As these landscapes changed, the relationship between people and their environment shifted as well. Land that had once been wilderness became carefully managed farmland, though forests and commons remained essential for grazing animals and gathering resources like firewood. All of this expansion, however, carried risks. When population rises faster than agricultural resilience, societies become vulnerable to sudden shocks. By the early 14th century, parts of Europe were approaching such limits. A series of poor harvests, especially during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, revealed how fragile the system could be. Continuous rain damaged crops and prevented proper storage of grain. Livestock suffered from disease. Food prices soared, and hunger spread across large regions. Chroniclers described desperate conditions: people searching forests for edible roots, communities struggling to maintain order, and governments attempting to control rising prices. These crises remind us that medieval progress was rarely smooth or guaranteed. Gains in trade, technology, and organization could be undone by environmental disaster or political conflict. Yet communities continued to adapt. They repaired infrastructure, renegotiated obligations, and rebuilt after setbacks. In many ways, resilience defined medieval society. Survival required cooperation as much as authority, patience as much as ambition. And perhaps that is one of the most overlooked truths about medieval times. When we strip away the simplified images of castles and battles, what remains is a world full of systems quietly holding everyday life together. Fields were measured, tolls recorded, prayers spoken, markets negotiated, and disputes settled. People woke before sunrise, worked long hours, worried about the harvest, and hoped their children would inherit something stable enough to continue the cycle. Medieval history is not only the story of rulers and wars. It is the story of millions of ordinary lives balanced carefully between tradition and change. But some of the most surprising aspects of the medieval world, the ones that almost never appear in popular history, emerge when we look even closer at the strange, overlooked details of daily life. And those details reveal a medieval society that was far more complex, inventive, and sometimes unexpected than the familiar stories ever suggest. But when we move beyond the familiar outlines of medieval life, beyond the villages, cathedrals, and markets, we begin to encounter details that rarely appear in ordinary history books. These smaller, often overlooked realities reveal how creative, practical, and sometimes strange the medieval world could be. Many of them were not dramatic events. Instead, they were everyday systems and roles that quietly supported society for centuries. One such example is the surprising number of specialized occupations that existed in medieval communities. We often imagine a simple division between peasants, craftsmen, and nobles, but the reality was far more detailed. In towns and royal courts, there were positions whose responsibilities sound unusual to modern ears. For example, some castles employed officials whose duty was to supervise the quality of bread. Bread was not merely food, it was the foundation of survival for most of the population. Poorly baked bread could spoil quickly, waste grain, or spread illness. As a result, regulations in many towns controlled the size, weight, and price of loaves. Inspectors, sometimes called bread wardens, could visit bakeries and markets to ensure these standards were maintained. The stability of an entire community depended on such seemingly small acts of oversight. Another little-known occupation was the gong farmer, whose work involved managing waste from urban cesspits and latrines. Medieval towns had no modern sewage systems, yet sanitation still had to be addressed somehow. Gong farmers operated mainly at night, removing accumulated waste and transporting it outside the city walls. It was unpleasant and dangerous work, but also essential. Without these laborers, disease and foul conditions could quickly overwhelm crowded neighborhoods. In a society where survival often depended on maintaining order in difficult environments, even the most uncomfortable tasks became structured professions. Royal households had their own unusual roles as well. The scale of a medieval royal court could be enormous. Hundreds of people might be responsible for feeding, clothing, protecting, and serving the monarch and their guests. Among these officials were keepers of wardrobes, guardians of hunting dogs, supervisors of falconry birds, and clerks responsible for tracking inventories of everything from candles to wine barrels. Falconry itself was a highly respected skill in aristocratic circles. Trained birds of prey, hawks, falcons, and sometimes eagles were used for hunting game. Each bird required careful training and attention. Falconers studied the behavior of their birds closely, learning how to maintain their health and discipline. Manuals written during the Middle Ages reveal a surprisingly advanced understanding of animal care and training. The medieval world also contained elaborate systems of measurement and verification that are often forgotten today. For instance, towns frequently kept official weights and measures stored in public buildings. Merchants could be required to compare their scales against these standards to prevent fraud. Market inspectors monitored transactions, ensuring that goods such as cloth or grain were sold honestly. In many places, violating these rules could result in fines or public punishment. These regulations were not only about fairness, they were about trust. Markets functioned only if buyers believed that goods were measured accurately. Even clothing could become the subject of regulation. Medieval societies often used what historians call sumptuary laws. These laws attempted to control what people could wear based on their social status. Certain fabrics, colors, or decorative elements might be restricted to nobles or wealthy merchants. The purpose was partly economic, limiting excessive spending on imported luxuries, but it was also symbolic. Clothing acted as a visible marker of hierarchy. A person's position in society could sometimes be recognized instantly through the materials and styles they were permitted to wear. Despite these attempts to maintain clear distinctions, medieval fashion could be remarkably creative. Bright colors, elaborate embroidery, and distinctive headwear were common in many regions. Dyeing techniques produced vibrant reds, blues, and yellows using plants, minerals, and insects. The famous deep red dye derived from crushed insects known as kermes became particularly prized in parts of Europe. Garments were often layered and carefully tailored, reflecting not only wealth but also practical needs for warmth and durability. The attention given to clothing hints at a broader truth about medieval society. People cared deeply about appearance, ceremony, and symbolism. Public rituals were everywhere. When a new lord took control of land, ceremonies might confirm the transfer of authority. When a king traveled through a town, elaborate welcomes were organized. Guilds marched in religious processions carrying banners that displayed their trade symbols. Weddings, funerals, and coronations followed established patterns meant to reinforce social order. Even punishment could be theatrical. Public spaces such as market squares served as stages where authority and justice were demonstrated. Medieval law sometimes included methods that seem unusual today but were deeply meaningful within the cultural framework of the time. One example was the practice known as trial by ordeal, which appeared in parts of early medieval Europe. In such cases, A person accused of wrongdoing might undergo a physical test, such as holding a hot object or placing a hand in boiling water. The belief was that divine judgment would reveal innocence or guilt through the outcome of the ordeal. While this practice may seem irrational to modern observers, it existed within a society where divine intervention was considered a real and immediate force in human affairs. Over time, especially by the High Middle Ages, many regions moved toward more formal legal procedures and evidence-based trials. Another lesser-known feature of medieval life was the widespread use of communal ovens and brewing facilities. Brewing ale was a daily necessity in many communities because fermented beverages were often safer to drink than untreated water. Women, known as alewives, frequently played a central role in producing and selling ale within villages and towns. Brewing required knowledge of ingredients, fermentation timing, and storage techniques. Local authorities sometimes inspected ale quality just as they did bread. A poorly brewed batch could spoil quickly or cause illness, so standards mattered. Technological creativity also appears in places where we might not expect it. Medieval engineers built complex mechanical clocks in cathedral towers during the later Middle Ages. These early timepieces used gears and weights to regulate movement, representing an important step in the development of precision machinery. Watermills and windmills spread widely across Europe, transforming natural energy from rivers and wind into mechanical power for grinding grain, sawing wood, and processing materials. Such innovations reduced manual labor and allowed communities to produce goods more efficiently. Agricultural tools evolved as well. Iron plowshares, improved harness systems, and better crop management techniques gradually increased productivity. Farmers carefully observed weather patterns, soil conditions, and seasonal cycles. Their knowledge was practical rather than theoretical, built through generations of observation. Medieval farming manuals sometimes recorded advice on planting schedules, livestock care, and land management. These documents remind us that rural communities possessed valuable expertise that rarely appears in dramatic historical narratives. Animals themselves were deeply integrated into medieval life. Horses provided transportation and labor, oxen pulled plows, sheep supplied wool for textiles, and chickens produced eggs. Dogs guarded property and assisted with hunting. Even cats had a place in many households, valued for controlling rodents that could damage stored grain. The relationship between people and animals was constant and immediate, shaping daily routines in ways that modern urban societies rarely experience. The presence of animals also influenced medieval urban design. Streets were often shared by people, carts, and livestock. Markets sold live animals alongside produce and crafted goods. Regulations attempted to keep order, limiting where animals could roam or requiring certain areas for slaughter, but enforcement varied widely. Medieval towns were lively, noisy places where the boundaries between domestic, commercial, and agricultural spaces often overlapped. One of the most fascinating yet rarely discussed aspects of medieval culture is the importance of storytelling and oral tradition. While written chronicles preserved official histories, everyday people transmitted knowledge through spoken narratives. Folk tales, legends of saints, heroic epics, and local myths circulated widely. Traveling performers carried stories from one region to another, gradually shaping shared cultural memory. These stories served multiple purposes: entertainment, moral instruction, and preservation of community identity. Monasteries and scriptoria played a crucial role in preserving written knowledge during the medieval centuries. Monks copied manuscripts carefully by hand, reproducing religious texts as well as works of classical philosophy, science, and literature. The process required patience and precision. Ink was prepared from natural materials, parchment was made from animal skins, and scribes worked under dim light for long hours. Illuminated manuscripts, decorated with intricate illustrations and gold leaf, became some of the most beautiful artistic creations of the era. But even as monks preserved older knowledge, new intellectual centers were emerging. By the 12th and 13th centuries, universities began to appear in cities such as Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. These institutions brought together scholars who studied law, theology, philosophy, and medicine. Students traveled long distances to attend lectures, forming communities dedicated to learning. Medieval universities were not identical to modern ones, yet they established traditions of debate, scholarship, and structured education that continue today. Looking at all these details together, the specialized occupations, regulatory systems, technological experiments, and cultural practices, it becomes clear that medieval society was far more intricate than the simplified image many people hold. It was a world of constant negotiation between tradition and innovation, hierarchy and adaptation. And perhaps the most striking realization is this: the medieval world did not see itself as medieval. The people living within it believed they were simply part of the ongoing human story. They built institutions, solved practical problems, and passed knowledge to the next generation, just as societies do today. Yet some of the most dramatic transformations of the medieval age were still ahead. Events that would reshape population, belief, politics, and everyday life across entire continents. Those turning points would expose both the strengths and the vulnerabilities of medieval civilization in ways that no one living at the time could have predicted. As the medieval centuries progressed, the systems that held society together were increasingly tested by forces that few people could fully understand at the time. Climate, disease, political ambition, and economic strain all interacted in ways that reshaped entire regions. What makes this period especially fascinating is not only the scale of these changes, but the quiet, everyday experiences that accompanied them, details that often remain overlooked in popular discussions of medieval history. One such detail is how medieval communities understood and managed risk. In a world without modern forecasting, insurance companies, or centralized emergency systems, people developed their own ways of preparing for uncertainty. Grain storage was one of the most important strategies. Communities built granaries where surplus harvest could be kept for future use. These stores might belong to a lord, a monastery, a town authority, or sometimes a cooperative group of villagers. The goal was simple but crucial. If one harvest failed, the stored grain might carry the community through the next planting season. Of course, maintaining these reserves required careful administration. Grain had to be protected from moisture, pests, and theft. Officials recorded how much had been collected and how much could safely be distributed during difficult times. These records reveal a medieval concern with resource management that often goes unnoticed. Survival required foresight, and even relatively small villages developed systems to guard against the unpredictable nature of agriculture. Water management was another quiet but vital aspect of medieval life. Rivers, wells, and springs were lifelines for both towns and rural settlements. Engineers and laborers constructed channels, dams, and drainage systems to guide water where it was needed. In some regions, irrigation networks allowed fields to remain productive during dry seasons. In others, drainage projects reclaimed marshland, turning wetlands into usable farmland. These efforts demanded cooperation among landowners, workers, and local authorities. The landscape itself became a carefully negotiated system shaped by human labor. Medieval bridges offer another glimpse into the practical ingenuity of the era. Rivers that appear small today could once pose serious barriers to travel and trade. Constructing a stable bridge required skilled builders and significant resources. Stone bridges in particular were impressive achievements, with carefully designed arches that distributed weight evenly across the structure. Many of these bridges included small chapels or shrines, reflecting the medieval belief that divine protection might help safeguard travelers crossing dangerous waters. Travel itself was far more common than many people imagine. While the majority of medieval individuals spent most of their lives near home, roads still carried a steady flow of merchants, messengers, pilgrims, soldiers, and wandering laborers. Pilgrimage routes in particular formed vast networks across Europe and beyond. Some travelers journeyed to Rome or Jerusalem, while others visited regional shrines believed to hold the relics of saints. These journeys could take weeks or months, exposing pilgrims to unfamiliar languages, customs, and landscapes. In this way, pilgrimage served as one of the few opportunities for ordinary people to experience a broader world. Along these roads stood inns, monasteries, and hostels where travelers could find shelter. Hospitality was not merely kindness. It was often considered a religious duty. Monasteries especially became important stopping points, offering food, rest, and sometimes medical care. For monks, welcoming travelers provided both spiritual merit and a chance to gather news from distant regions. Information traveled with people, and monasteries often became hubs where stories from far away were recorded or shared. Medieval roads themselves varied widely in quality. Some followed the remains of Roman routes, still recognizable centuries after the empire's decline. Others were simple dirt tracks shaped by repeated use. During dry weather they could be dusty and uneven, but heavy rain might turn them into deep mud that slowed carts and horses. Despite these difficulties, trade continued to expand, particularly in regions where rivers or coastal shipping offered more reliable transportation. The movement of goods also introduced medieval societies to products from remarkably distant places. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, and cloves traveled along long trade routes connecting Europe with Asia and the Middle East. These goods were expensive and often reserved for wealthy households, but their presence reveals how interconnected parts of the medieval world had become. Silk fabrics, precious stones, and rare metals also circulated through these networks, passing through many hands before reaching final buyers. Markets played a crucial role in distributing such goods. Weekly markets allowed villagers to exchange surplus produce, tools, and household items. Larger fairs attracted merchants dealing in bulk commodities and luxury products. These fairs sometimes lasted several weeks and included entertainment, legal proceedings, and financial transactions alongside trade. Contracts were signed, debts recorded, and partnerships formed. The marketplace was therefore not just an economic space. It was also a social and political arena where communities negotiated relationships and authority. Another often overlooked aspect of medieval society was the way communities handled conflict. Disputes were inevitable in a world where resources were limited and obligations were complex. Land boundaries, inheritance rights, trade agreements, and personal grievances could all lead to disagreements. Medieval courts existed to address these issues, but many conflicts were resolved through mediation before reaching formal judgment. Elders, local officials, or respected community members might help negotiate settlements. Compensation, rather than punishment, often served as the preferred solution. This approach reflects a broader cultural emphasis on restoring balance rather than simply imposing penalties. A dispute between neighbors could disrupt the entire community if left unresolved. Negotiation, therefore, became a practical necessity. Written agreements recorded the outcome, ensuring that future generations would remember the terms of the settlement. Education during the medieval period also deserves closer attention. Although literacy rates were limited compared with modern societies, education existed in several forms. Monastic schools trained young men for religious life, teaching them Latin, scripture, and basic intellectual skills. Cathedral schools prepared clergy and administrators who would serve in church or royal institutions. As universities emerged, these centers of learning began to attract students from across Europe. The intellectual environment of medieval universities could be surprisingly lively. Scholars debated philosophical questions drawn from ancient Greek texts, many of which had been preserved and transmitted through Arabic scholarship. Works by Aristotle, translated into Latin, became central to university education. Teachers and students engaged in structured debates known as disputations, where arguments were carefully examined and challenged. These discussions formed part of a growing intellectual tradition that emphasized logic, analysis, and careful interpretation. Outside formal education, practical knowledge circulated through apprenticeships and family traditions. A young carpenter might spend years learning how to select wood, shape beams, and assemble structures. A blacksmith mastered the art of heating and hammering metal to produce tools and weapons. These skills were not written in textbooks but transmitted through observation and repetition. The medieval workshop functioned as a classroom where knowledge passed directly from master to apprentice. Art and craftsmanship flourished in this environment. Stone carvings on cathedral facades, illuminated manuscripts, metalwork, and woven textiles all demonstrate the extraordinary talent of medieval artisans. Many artists remain anonymous today because their work was considered part of a collective tradition rather than individual expression. Yet their creations continue to shape our understanding of the medieval aesthetic, an intricate blend of religious symbolism, geometric design, and storytelling through images. Music also held an important place in medieval culture. Churches developed complex traditions of chant, particularly Gregorian chant, which used carefully structured melodies to accompany religious texts. These musical forms were designed to enhance spiritual reflection and communal worship. Outside religious settings, musicians performed with instruments such as lutes, harps, and flutes, entertaining audiences in courts, towns, and traveling festivals. Despite the beauty and creativity found in medieval art and music, daily life remained grounded in practical realities. Most people measured success not in artistic achievement but in survival, ensuring that food, shelter, and family stability could be maintained through uncertain years. Yet within those constraints, medieval communities developed rich cultural traditions that gave meaning to their experiences. What becomes increasingly clear when examining these quieter aspects of the Middle Ages is that the era was not simply a backdrop for kings and battles. It was a vast tapestry of ordinary activities: repairing tools, tending animals, recording agreements, preparing food, teaching apprentices, welcoming travelers, and marking the passing seasons through ritual and celebration. These activities rarely appear in dramatic historical narratives, yet they formed the true foundation of medieval civilization. Without them, the castles, kingdoms, and famous events we remember today could never have existed. And as the medieval world continued to evolve, it would soon face challenges so profound that they would alter the course of European and global history. Events that revealed both the resilience and the fragility of the systems people had spent centuries building. As the later medieval centuries unfolded, the delicate balance that sustained everyday life began to face pressures that no community could easily control. These pressures did not arrive all at once. Instead, they accumulated slowly, appearing first as smaller disturbances. Unusual weather patterns, shifting trade conditions, political instability, or sudden population stress. For people living through these changes, the experience would not have felt like a dramatic turning point in history. It would have felt like a sequence of difficult years, each bringing its own uncertainty. One of the most important and least discussed influences on medieval society was climate. The centuries often associated with the High Middle Ages benefited from relatively stable and mild weather conditions in parts of Europe, sometimes referred to by historians as the medieval warm period. During this time, longer growing seasons and favorable temperatures allowed agriculture to expand into new areas. Vineyards appeared in regions that today would be considered marginal for grape cultivation. Harvests could be productive enough to support growing populations, and villages spread into lands that had once been forest or marsh. Yet climate stability is rarely permanent. By the early 14th century, signs of change began to appear. Wetter summers and colder winters created new challenges for farmers. Fields that had once produced reliable yields suddenly struggled under excessive rainfall or shorter growing seasons. Crops such as wheat, which were sensitive to damp conditions, suffered badly when harvest periods were repeatedly disrupted by storms. Stored grain sometimes spoiled, and livestock weakened as grazing conditions deteriorated. These environmental changes contributed to a series of crises that medieval chroniclers described with growing alarm. The Great Famine of the early 14th century stands as one of the most severe of these episodes. Continuous rain across large parts of northern Europe damaged crops year after year. Fields flooded, and farmers could not properly dry harvested grain. As food supplies dwindled, prices rose sharply. For wealthier households, this meant economic strain. For the poor, it meant hunger. What makes the famine particularly revealing is how it exposed the limits of medieval resilience. Communities attempted to adapt in many ways. People turned to alternative foods, roots, nuts, wild plants, and animals from forests. Governments in some regions attempted to control prices or distribute emergency supplies. Monasteries and charitable institutions provided assistance where they could. But the scale of the problem often overwhelmed these efforts. Chroniclers wrote about families selling possessions to buy food, villages experiencing waves of illness caused by malnutrition, and social tensions rising as resources became scarce. Yet even in these difficult years, daily life did not simply stop. Markets continued to operate, fields were still planted when possible, and communities maintained rituals and obligations that gave structure to uncertain times. This persistence reveals something essential about medieval society. People did not experience history as a series of dramatic chapters. They experienced it as the continuation of everyday responsibilities, even when conditions were harsh. Another aspect of medieval life that often goes unnoticed during these crises is the role of communication. News about famine, conflict, or opportunity moved slowly but steadily along the networks of travelers, merchants, and clergy. A merchant arriving at a distant market might bring word of failed harvests in another region. Pilgrims might report rumors of unrest or disease encountered along their journey. Monasteries recorded events in chronicles, creating written accounts that later historians would rely upon. These channels of communication allowed communities to learn about dangers or possibilities beyond their immediate surroundings. Political authorities also depended on these networks. Kings and local rulers relied on messengers to carry instructions, collect taxes, and maintain order across wide territories. Royal letters, sealed with wax and transported by mounted couriers, traveled between castles and administrative centers. The reliability of these systems varied, but they represented an important attempt to coordinate governance across fragmented landscapes. Within these political structures, medieval rulers faced a constant challenge: maintaining authority over populations that were geographically dispersed and socially diverse. Unlike modern centralized states, medieval kingdoms often depended on negotiated relationships with nobles, clergy, and towns. Power was rarely absolute. A king might command loyalty from major lords, but those lords governed their own lands with considerable independence. Local customs, privileges, and traditions shaped how laws were applied in different regions. This decentralized nature of authority sometimes allowed communities to adapt creatively to changing circumstances. Towns negotiated charters that granted them specific rights, including the ability to regulate markets or defend their walls. Guilds established rules for trade and craftsmanship that helped stabilize urban economies. Monasteries managed extensive agricultural estates with their own systems of record-keeping and resource management. In effect, medieval society operated through a web of institutions rather than a single centralized command structure. Religious life continued to play a central role in interpreting the hardships of the age. When harvests failed or disease spread, many people turned to prayer, processions, and acts of penance. Clergy organized public rituals asking for divine protection or forgiveness. Pilgrimage increased in times of anxiety, as believers sought the intercession of saints believed to possess miraculous powers. Shrines and relics became focal points of hope in an uncertain world. But religion also offered practical forms of support. Monasteries and churches often distributed food to the poor, provided lodging for travelers, and cared for the sick. In many towns, hospitals operated under religious authority, offering shelter and basic medical attention. Although medieval medicine lacked the scientific tools available today, caregivers used herbal treatments, dietary adjustments, and careful observation to address illness as best they could. Another rarely discussed feature of medieval resilience was the importance of collective labor. Large tasks, such as repairing roads, maintaining bridges, harvesting crops, or constructing defensive walls, often required coordinated effort from entire communities. Villagers gathered to complete seasonal work that no individual household could manage alone. These shared responsibilities reinforced social bonds while ensuring that essential infrastructure remained functional. Festivals and seasonal celebrations also persisted during difficult years. These events provided moments of relief from daily pressures. Music, dancing, games, and shared meals created temporary spaces where worries could be set aside. For historians, these gatherings offer evidence that medieval communities valued emotional balance as much as physical survival. Joy and celebration were not luxuries. They were part of maintaining morale during uncertain times. Trade networks, though disrupted by famine and conflict, continued to expand gradually across the medieval world. Merchant ships crossed the Mediterranean and the North Sea, carrying goods between ports that linked distant cultures. Italian city-states such as Venice and Genoa developed powerful maritime fleets that connected European markets with regions in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. These exchanges introduced new products, ideas, and technologies into European societies. The spread of knowledge followed similar routes. Translations of scientific and philosophical texts moved through scholarly networks, often traveling from Arabic-speaking regions into Latin Europe through centers of learning in Spain and Italy. These translations reintroduced works by ancient thinkers such as Aristotle, stimulating debates that shaped medieval universities. Scholars examined questions about nature, ethics, and the structure of the universe with renewed intensity. At the same time, technological innovation continued quietly within workshops and rural communities. Metal workers refined techniques for producing stronger tools and weapons. Builders experimented with architectural designs that allowed structures to reach unprecedented heights. Glassmakers improved methods for producing clear panes used in cathedral windows. These advances did not occur suddenly. They accumulated through years of patient experimentation and shared experience. Despite these achievements, medieval society remained vulnerable to forces beyond human control. Disease, in particular, posed a threat that communities could neither predict nor fully understand. Illness had always been present in medieval life, but the interconnected trade networks of the 14th century created pathways through which epidemics could travel more quickly than before. Ports, markets, and trade routes that brought prosperity also carried unseen dangers. For people living at the time, the medieval world must have felt both stable and fragile at once. Villages followed rhythms that had endured for generations. Institutions such as guilds, monasteries, and royal courts appeared deeply rooted. Yet beneath that surface stability lay systems that depended heavily on favorable conditions: good harvests, peaceful trade routes, manageable climate patterns, and basic public health. When those conditions faltered, the entire structure of medieval life could be shaken. But the story of the Middle Ages is not only about collapse or crisis. It is also about adaptation. Communities reorganized their labor, renegotiated obligations, and rebuilt after disasters. Institutions evolved, sometimes slowly and sometimes rapidly, responding to new challenges with creativity and persistence. And in many ways, that ability to endure uncertainty became the defining characteristic of medieval civilization. The people of the Middle Ages lived in a world where change often arrived without warning, yet they continued to cultivate land, construct cities, develop knowledge, and maintain cultural traditions that would shape the centuries to come. because hidden beneath the hardships and complexities of medieval life was a society constantly preparing, often without realizing it, for transformations that would eventually reshape Europe and the wider world in ways far beyond anything its inhabitants could have imagined. As the medieval centuries continued to unfold, the world that people had carefully built through agriculture, trade, and tradition began to move toward a period of transformation that few could have predicted. For generations, communities had relied on routines that felt stable. Planting in the spring, harvesting in the autumn, attending church on familiar feast days, and gathering in markets that followed the same rhythms year after year. Yet beneath that stability, deeper forces were slowly reshaping medieval society. One of the most important of these forces was the growth of long-distance commerce. While trade had existed throughout the Middle Ages, the later centuries saw an increasingly complex network of merchants connecting regions that had once been far more isolated. Ships carried wool from England to the textile workshops of Flanders. Grain moved through river systems to feed growing urban populations. Wine from southern Europe traveled north, while timber, iron, and furs moved in the opposite direction. Every voyage tied distant places together, creating relationships that stretched far beyond the boundaries of any single kingdom. Merchants played a unique role in this expanding system. Unlike farmers or craftsmen whose lives were closely tied to a specific place, merchants were constantly moving. They traveled between markets, fairs, and ports, negotiating prices and arranging shipments. Their journeys exposed them to new languages, customs, and ideas. In many ways, merchants acted as the connective tissue of the medieval economy, linking towns and villages into a broader web of exchange. Travel by sea was especially important. Mediterranean trade routes connected European markets with North Africa and the Middle East. The cities of Venice and Genoa became powerful maritime republics whose fleets dominated large portions of the sea. Their ships carried spices, silk, sugar, and other luxury goods that had traveled from even farther east along the vast commercial routes stretching into Asia. These goods passed through many hands before reaching European buyers, each stage of the journey adding to their cost and rarity. For most ordinary people, such exotic goods remained distant curiosities. Pepper or cinnamon might appear occasionally in the kitchens of wealthy households, but the daily diet of most medieval communities remained simple. Bread, grains, vegetables, and small amounts of meat or dairy formed the foundation of everyday meals. Seasonal availability shaped what people ate, and preservation methods such as salting, drying, or smoking helped store food through the winter months. Even within these modest diets, regional differences were significant. Coastal communities relied heavily on fish, while inland areas depended more on livestock and grains. Forested regions offered nuts, berries, and game animals. These variations created a mosaic of culinary traditions that reflected the landscapes people inhabited. The preparation of food was itself an intricate process requiring knowledge and patience. Grain harvested from fields had to be threshed, winnowed, and ground into flour before bread could be baked. Brewing ale required careful fermentation and monitoring. Cheesemaking demanded precise timing to ensure that milk curdled properly and matured into a usable product. Each step represented skills developed through generations of practice. Inside medieval homes, daily routines revolved around work that modern societies sometimes overlook. Spinning wool into thread, weaving cloth, repairing tools, tending gardens, and caring for animals filled much of the day. Households were small centers of production where families created many of the items they needed to survive. Even simple tasks required coordination. Firewood had to be gathered, water drawn from wells, and meals prepared over open hearths. Lighting, for example, was a constant concern. Without modern electricity, evenings depended on candles, oil lamps, or the light of a hearth fire. Candles made from beeswax were valuable and often reserved for churches or wealthy households. Most people used candles made from animal fat, known as tallow. These produced dim light and sometimes unpleasant smoke, but they allowed activities such as sewing, reading, or conversation to continue after sunset. Night itself carried a different meaning in medieval life than it does today. Darkness could be deep and complete, especially in rural areas far from towns. Without artificial lighting, the night sky appeared filled with stars in a way that modern urban environments rarely allow. For medieval observers, these stars were not merely distant objects. They were part of a cosmos believed to reflect divine order. Astronomical observations were closely connected to astrology, which attempted to interpret how celestial movements might influence events on Earth. Astrology was taken seriously in many medieval courts. Rulers sometimes consulted astrologers before making major decisions such as launching military campaigns or scheduling important ceremonies. While modern science does not support these beliefs, astrology reflected a broader medieval desire to understand patterns in the universe. Medieval scholars explored these questions within universities and monastic libraries, where ancient texts were studied alongside newer writings. Knowledge from Greek philosophers, Roman authors, and Arabic scientists circulated through translated manuscripts. These works introduced ideas about mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and natural philosophy that expanded medieval intellectual horizons. Students in medieval universities often traveled great distances to attend lectures. They gathered in crowded halls where masters explained complex ideas through readings and debates. The atmosphere could be intense, with arguments about theology, logic, and philosophy continuing long after formal lessons ended. Universities developed reputations for particular fields of study. Bologna became famous for law, Paris for theology, and Oxford for philosophy and natural science. Although these centers of learning represented only a small portion of the population, their influence gradually spread outward. Clerics trained in universities served as administrators, judges, and advisors within royal governments. Their education allowed them to interpret legal documents, manage financial records, and communicate across regions using Latin as a common scholarly language. Latin itself functioned as a bridge between cultures. While everyday speech differed widely from place to place, Latin allowed educated individuals from different kingdoms to read the same texts and correspond with one another. Letters written in Latin traveled between monasteries, universities, and royal courts, carrying ideas that shaped medieval thought. Despite these intellectual exchanges, most medieval people lived within communities where oral communication remained dominant. News was shared through conversation in marketplaces, churchyards, and village gatherings. Storytelling preserved local history and cultural traditions. Songs and poems celebrated heroes, saints, and memorable events. Through these spoken forms, communities maintained a sense of identity that connected past generations with the present. The medieval world therefore balanced two forms of knowledge at once. Written records preserved official decisions and scholarly ideas, while oral traditions carried everyday experience and memory. Together, they formed a complex cultural landscape that cannot easily be reduced to simple categories. Over time, however, the pressures building within medieval society would begin to test both of these systems. Expanding trade networks increased interaction between distant populations. Growing towns brought people into closer contact with one another. Environmental changes strained agricultural production. Political rivalries created instability across large territories. Individually, these developments might have seemed manageable. Medieval communities had survived hardship before, but when several of these forces converged at once, the results could be profound. Systems that had appeared durable for centuries suddenly revealed unexpected weaknesses. Yet even in the face of such challenges, the medieval world continued to demonstrate remarkable adaptability. Farmers experimented with new crops and farming methods. Merchants adjusted trade routes in response to shifting political conditions. Religious institutions expanded charitable efforts to assist those in need. Town governments strengthened regulations designed to maintain order during uncertain times. All of these responses illustrate an essential truth about medieval society. It was not passive or stagnant. It was a living system constantly adjusting to new realities. People observed the world around them carefully, drawing upon tradition while also experimenting with new solutions. And as these adaptations continued, the medieval era quietly moved toward a series of turning points that would redefine the social, economic, and intellectual landscape of Europe and beyond. What had once been a world built around local rhythms and familiar traditions was slowly becoming part of a far larger and more interconnected story. As medieval society moved deeper into the 14th and 15th centuries, the interconnected systems that had slowly developed over generations began to reveal just how dependent they were on balance. Trade, agriculture, political authority, religion, and everyday community life all relied on a delicate web of cooperation and stability. When one part of that web weakened, the effects could travel outward in ways that no one living at the time fully understood. One of the quiet but powerful changes during the later medieval period was the increasing importance of record keeping. Earlier centuries had certainly used written documents, but by the late Middle Ages, the habit of documenting almost everything became far more widespread. Town councils kept registers of meetings, taxes, and property disputes. Merchants recorded transactions and debts with remarkable precision. Monasteries preserved chronicles that described local and regional events year by year. These records were not created for historians in the future. They were tools for managing everyday life. A merchant needed proof that a shipment had been paid for. A town council required written agreements to regulate markets and public works. Landowners recorded boundaries and obligations so that future generations would understand their rights. Over time, these documents accumulated into large archives that reveal how organized medieval society had become. The ability to read and write therefore gained new value. Literacy was still limited compared to modern societies, but it expanded gradually as administration grew more complex. Clerks and scribes became essential professionals in both royal governments and urban institutions. Their work ensured that decisions could be communicated clearly and remembered accurately. The materials used for writing also evolved during this period. Early medieval manuscripts were typically written on parchment made from animal skins, which was durable but expensive to produce. By the later Middle Ages, paper began to spread across Europe after its earlier development in the Islamic world and Asia. Paper was far less costly than parchment, allowing written communication to become more common. This change alone helped accelerate the flow of information. Within universities and scholarly communities, the growing availability of paper made it easier for students to copy lecture notes and share texts. Knowledge could circulate more rapidly than before. Scholars wrote commentaries on philosophy, law, medicine, and theology, building intellectual traditions that stretched across generations. Even outside formal education, written communication began to influence daily life. Contracts, marriage agreements, wills, and business partnerships increasingly relied on written documents. The medieval world was gradually becoming more literate not only in its elite institutions but also in the practical routines of trade and governance. At the same time, towns continued to expand as centers of commerce and craft production. Streets filled with workshops where artisans practiced specialized skills that had been refined over centuries. Blacksmiths forged tools essential for farming and construction. Goldsmiths crafted delicate jewelry and ceremonial objects. Weavers produced textiles that ranged from simple wool cloth for everyday use to luxurious fabrics intended for wealthy patrons. The production of textiles was especially important to the medieval economy. Wool from sheep raised in rural pastures became the raw material for thriving industries in towns across northern Europe. Spinners transformed wool fibers into thread, which weavers then turned into cloth. Dyers added color using pigments derived from plants, minerals, and insects. Finally, fullers and finishers prepared the cloth for sale by cleaning, stretching, and smoothing it. This complex process involved many stages and many workers, demonstrating how interconnected medieval labor could be. A single garment represented the combined effort of farmers, shepherds, spinners, weavers, dyers, and merchants. The medieval economy functioned as a chain of specialized tasks that linked countryside and town together. Guilds continued to play a central role in organizing this work. By setting standards for training and production, guilds attempted to protect both quality and reputation. Apprentices spent years learning a trade before becoming journeymen and eventually masters. These stages were not merely technical. They were social steps that defined a person's place within the craft community. Guilds also provided a sense of identity. Members participated in shared celebrations, religious observances, and charitable activities. When one member faced hardship, the guild might provide assistance to the family. In this way, professional organizations also served as social safety networks. Urban life, however, was not always harmonious. Competition between guilds could become intense, particularly when economic conditions changed. Conflicts occasionally erupted between merchants seeking greater freedom of trade and guilds determined to protect traditional regulations. Town councils often had to mediate these disputes, balancing economic growth with social stability. Beyond the towns, rural communities continued to depend heavily on agricultural cycles. Farming techniques improved gradually, but success still depended on weather and soil conditions. Farmers carefully observed natural signs, cloud patterns, animal behavior, and seasonal plant growth to anticipate changes in the environment. Livestock remained an essential component of rural life. Sheep provided wool, cows produced milk, pigs supplied meat, and horses assisted with transportation and fieldwork. Animals were not separate from human society. They were integrated into daily routines and economic planning. Forests also played a significant role in medieval economies. They supplied timber for construction, firewood for heating, and raw materials for tools and household goods. Forests provided grazing areas for pigs and other animals, while hunters sought game for food and trade. Control over woodland resources could become a source of political conflict, especially when rulers attempted to reserve large tracts of forest for royal hunting grounds. Despite the hardships of agricultural life, villages maintained strong communal traditions. Seasonal festivals marked important moments in the year, such as planting and harvest. Music, dance, and storytelling brought people together after long periods of labor. These gatherings reinforced the sense that survival depended not only on individual effort but also on collective support. Children grew up learning these traditions from an early age. Many began assisting with work as soon as they were physically able. Boys might help with herding animals or preparing fields, while girls often participated in domestic productions such as spinning or food preparation. Education in rural communities was usually informal, passed from parents to children through observation and participation. Marriage represented another central institution in medieval society. Beyond personal relationships, marriage created alliances between families and ensured the continuation of property and social ties. Ceremonies varied by region, but they often involved both religious blessings and communal celebration. The presence of neighbors and relatives confirmed that the union had social recognition. Within households, daily responsibilities were shared according to ability and necessity. Women played crucial roles in managing food supplies, producing textiles, caring for children, and assisting with agricultural tasks. Their work was essential to maintaining household stability, even though historical records often emphasize male authority in legal and political matters. Health and medicine continued to rely on a combination of traditional knowledge and scholarly theory. Physicians trained in universities studied ancient medical texts, particularly those of Greek and Roman writers such as Galen and Hippocrates. These works described the human body as governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, which needed to remain in balance. Treatments often aimed to restore this balance through diet, herbal remedies, or procedures such as bloodletting. While some of these practices were ineffective by modern standards, others reflected careful observation of symptoms and natural remedies. Herbal medicine in particular drew upon centuries of accumulated experience. Hospitals and infirmaries, frequently operated by religious institutions, offered care to the sick and elderly. Although these facilities lacked modern medical technology, they provided shelter, basic treatment, and spiritual comfort. The connection between healing and religion remained strong, with prayers and rituals often accompanying medical care. Through all of these aspects of life, workshops, farms, markets, monasteries, and households, the medieval world continued to evolve. Each generation inherited traditions from the past while adapting them to new circumstances. Change rarely occurred suddenly. Instead, it unfolded slowly through countless small decisions made by individuals responding to immediate challenges. Looking back across these centuries, it becomes clear that the Middle Ages were not simply a static era between ancient and modern times. They were a dynamic period during which institutions, technologies, and cultural practices developed in ways that laid important foundations for the future. The everyday realities of medieval life, working the land, maintaining trade networks, preserving knowledge, raising families, and navigating social hierarchies, created a complex civilization that endured for hundreds of years. And as those centuries drew closer to their end, the accumulated experiences of medieval society would soon intersect with new discoveries, shifting political power, and expanding global connections that would gradually carry Europe and much of the world into a very different historical age. As the later medieval world moved toward its final centuries, something subtle but powerful began to change in how people understood knowledge, authority, and the wider world around them. For generations, medieval society had relied on a framework that balanced tradition with experience. Customs guided daily behavior, Religious teaching shaped moral understanding, and practical knowledge passed from parent to child or master to apprentice ensured that essential skills survived. But during the closing centuries of the Middle Ages, new currents of curiosity and inquiry slowly began to appear. These changes did not replace medieval traditions overnight. Instead, they grew gradually from within the structures that already existed: monasteries, universities, courts, and trading cities. One of the quiet engines behind this transformation was the steady growth of cities. By the 14th and 15th centuries, urban life had become increasingly complex. Larger populations meant more specialized professions, more organized governments, and more elaborate economic networks. City officials managed taxation, public works, and legal disputes with a level of administrative detail that earlier centuries rarely required. To handle these responsibilities, cities relied heavily on educated clerks who could write, calculate, and maintain records. These administrators worked in town halls and council chambers, keeping accounts of property ownership, market regulations, and trade agreements. Their ledgers reveal a world in which medieval cities functioned almost like carefully managed machines, balancing income and expenditure while maintaining infrastructure such as bridges, walls, and roads. Urban architecture itself reflected the growing confidence of medieval towns. Stone guildhalls, marketplaces, and administrative buildings began to dominate city centers. These structures served not only practical purposes but also symbolic ones. They demonstrated the wealth and independence of the community, reminding visitors that towns were becoming important centers of political as well as economic power. Cathedrals continued to stand as the most striking landmarks in many medieval cities. Their towering spires and intricate facades represented both religious devotion and civic pride. Building a cathedral required enormous resources: quarries for stone, forests for timber, workshops for glass and sculpture. Construction could take decades or even centuries, with each generation contributing to a project that would outlast them. Inside these vast spaces, light filtered through stained glass windows that told stories from scripture and history. For many medieval people, these images served as a visual form of education. In a society where literacy was limited, art provided a way to communicate ideas about morality, faith, and human experience. Yet medieval art was not confined to cathedrals alone. Workshops across Europe produced illuminated manuscripts, carved altarpieces, metalwork, and textiles that displayed extraordinary craftsmanship. Gold leaf shimmered on the pages of religious books. Detailed embroidery decorated garments and ceremonial banners. These creations reflected a culture that valued patience, skill, and attention to detail. Meanwhile, the growth of trade continued to reshape the economic landscape. Merchant families accumulated wealth through long-distance commerce, investing in ships, warehouses, and trading partnerships. Some of these merchants became influential political figures within their cities, helping shape policies that supported commercial expansion. the organization of trade became increasingly sophisticated. Merchants formed partnerships that allowed them to share the risks and profits of long voyages. Financial tools such as letters of credit enabled them to conduct business across vast distances without carrying large quantities of precious metals. These developments made commerce more flexible and efficient, encouraging further growth. Ports became particularly important hubs in this expanding system. Cities along the Mediterranean, the Baltic Sea, and the Atlantic coast connected inland regions with maritime trade routes. Ships arrived carrying goods from distant lands: grain, wool, spices, timber, and precious metals. Dockyards bustled with activity as cargo was unloaded, stored, and redistributed. In Northern Europe, the Hanseatic League emerged as a powerful network of trading cities. From ports such as Lübeck, Hamburg, and Riga, merchants coordinated the movement of goods across the Baltic and North Seas. This alliance provided protection for traders, standardized commercial practices, and strengthened the economic influence of its member cities. These expanding trade networks did more than move goods. They also carried ideas, technologies, and cultural influences from one region to another. A merchant returning from a distant port might bring stories about unfamiliar customs, new inventions, or political developments. Over time, these exchanges contributed to a gradual widening of medieval perspectives. Travel, though still challenging, became more frequent among certain groups. Scholars journeyed between universities, merchants followed established trade routes, and diplomats carried messages between courts. Pilgrims continued to travel to religious shrines, maintaining networks of spiritual movement that had existed for centuries. Along these routes, travelers encountered landscapes shaped by generations of human effort. Fields divided into long strips revealed patterns of communal farming. Villages clustered around churches and wells. Castles guarded river crossings and strategic roads. The medieval countryside was not a wilderness but a carefully managed environment reflecting centuries of labor and negotiation. Despite these developments, daily life for most medieval people remained centered on familiar routines. Farmers still rose before sunrise to work the land. Craftsmen opened their workshops at first light. Markets filled with buyers and sellers discussing prices and exchanging goods. Children learned their roles within families and communities through observation and participation. Religion continued to shape the rhythm of the year. Church bells marked the passing hours, calling believers to prayer and reminding them of sacred obligations. Festivals celebrating saints or seasonal transitions brought moments of joy and communal gathering. These traditions provided continuity in a world where political and economic conditions could shift unexpectedly. But even as these routines continued, the medieval world was slowly becoming more interconnected. Roads and sea routes carried increasing numbers of travelers. Cities grew wealthier and more influential. Written communication spread as paper became easier to obtain. Universities attracted students from across Europe, encouraging the exchange of ideas. These developments did not erase medieval traditions. Instead, they layered new possibilities onto an existing framework of customs and institutions. The result was a society that still felt deeply rooted in its past while quietly preparing for a future that would look very different. Looking back today, it is easy to imagine the Middle Ages as a distant and unchanging era. Yet the closer we examine it, the more movement we see. Medieval society was full of innovation, negotiation, and adaptation. It was shaped by ordinary people managing farms, workshops, and households just as much as by kings and nobles. And perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval life is how many of its foundations continued to influence the centuries that followed. Systems of law, patterns of urban governance, traditions of scholarship, and networks of trade all evolved during this long period. By the time the medieval era approached its final chapters, the world it had created was already beginning to transform into something new. The habits of record-keeping, the growth of cities, the spread of knowledge, and the expansion of trade had quietly prepared the ground for changes that would soon reshape Europe and the wider world in ways medieval people themselves could scarcely imagine.